Hi, my name is Emily Harper, 30 years old, a financial analyst living in the Reno district of Denver. It was late September 2025. I was finishing up the last spreadsheet of the day when my phone lit up. A message from my mother. "We've changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore. Let's see how brave you really are, haha." I stared at the words, as if my eyes were searching for a typo. But there wasn't one. The sentence sat there neat, deliberate, and merciless. The first thing I felt wasn't anger, but emptiness. A cold, hollow kind of emptiness that made my hands tremble, then suddenly go still. In that small apartment, smelling faintly of stale coffee under dim light, I realized something. Home was never the house in Highlands Ranch with its white fences, green lawns, and my mother's carefully practiced sweetness. Home had once been the place I thought I belonged. But now I saw it clearly. It was only where they kept me long enough to use me, to control me, and to discard me once I no longer served their purpose. I used to think I was the pillar, the one who held everything together, who paid the bills, patched the roof, and filled the emotional gaps for everyone. Now I understood, pillar was just their word to make sure I never left. And that night, when the screen went dark, I knew this would no longer be the story of a daughter abandoned, but of justice. Of a woman who would rise, and for the first time in her life, choose herself. But what about you? If your own family sent you a message like that, what would you do? I truly want to know, where are you watching this story from? I grew up in a 2-story house in Highlands Ranch, Denver, the kind of place where white fences and perfectly trimmed lawns made people believe we were a picture-perfect American family. Every morning, my father, Robert Harper, poured his black coffee, straightened his tie, and walked out the door looking like the model suburban man. My mother, Linda, wore pressed clothes, a string of pearls, and smiled at the neighbors as if she had never raised her voice in her life. And Sophie, my sister, was the center of it all. She took ballet, painting, and piano lessons, and was always called Mommy's little star. I was different. By the age of 10, I already knew how to use a saw, paint fences, shovel snow, and wash the car. They called me the strong girl, as if it were a compliment, but it was really just a way to justify giving me all the heavy work. I remember one winter, the snow was piled up to my knees. My father looked out the window and said, "Emily, go shovel before it freezes." Sophie was in the living room, laughing at the TV, her feet wrapped in soft white wool socks. My mother looked at me and added, "You know you're strong. Go help your father." I didn't argue. Back then, I thought I was being trusted. I believed that if I worked harder, they would love me more. I truly believed that. The summer I turned 12, my father came home with cans of paint and said, "This weekend, we're repainting the fence." But we meant me. He went golfing. My mother spent the day organizing Sophie's closet, and I stood outside under the burning sun until my skin stung, sweat mixing with white paint streaking down my arms. When I finally finished, Linda came out, smiling faintly. "You did a good job, Emily." "Sophie, come here, let's take a picture. I want to capture how beautiful the new fence looks." And in that photograph, Sophie stood in front of the fence I had painted, wearing a white dress, smiling brightly while I stood behind her, my hands covered in paint, blurred in the background. That photo hung in our living room for the next 10 years. I can't remember how many times I worked late into the night just to earn a single, fleeting compliment. I learned that in our house, love was something you had to earn with sweat. Sophie only had to smile, but I had to work to earn the right to sit at the same table. When I got good grades, they said, "Of course, you're the hardworking one." When Sophie brought home average scores, they said, "It's okay, as long as you're happy." Once, I overheard my mother whisper to my father, "Emily will be fine, she's strong, but Sophie, she's fragile, we have to protect her." Protect. From that day on, I understood that every privilege, every dollar, every word of praise was reserved for the one who needed protection. And me, the one who was fine, was never allowed to break. My father taught Sophie how to play ping pong. I learned how to change light bulbs. He took Sophie to art classes. I was sent to drop off recyclables downtown every Saturday. My mother often said, "Emily, you really are the pillar of this family." I used to feel proud of that until I realized it was her way of saying I wasn't allowed to fall apart. There were nights when Sophie slept in her warm, glowing room, and I lay awake listening to the wind whistle through the cracks of my old window, thinking, maybe I just need to try a little harder. I truly believed that if I became perfect enough, they'd finally see me as someone worthy of love. But love in our house was like the gleam on that white picket fence, beautiful from a distance, cold when you got close. There's one memory I'll never forget. On my 13th birthday, I got a small cake my mother picked up from the grocery store. That same year, Sophie had a garden party with a live band, guests, balloons, and a dress imported from Italy. When I asked my mother why, she simply said, "Sophie needs encouragement. You're practical, you don't need those things." I smiled and nodded. But that night, I sat in my room, watching the lights from her party flicker through my window, and for the first time in my life, I felt like an outsider in my own home. That was how my childhood passed, without shouting, without violence, just the quiet persistence of injustice. It was built on false praise, the sweetly disguised word responsibility, and the way they made me believe that love must always come with sacrifice. They taught me that to be accepted, I had to be useful. And when you grow up believing your worth lies in what you can do for others, you don't realize you're being drained not until there's nothing left inside you. I left home at 18, carrying an old suitcase, a few sets of clothes, and a naive faith that if I studied hard and worked harder, life would eventually be fair. I got into the University of Colorado, Denver, majoring in finance. While my classmates waited for their parents' allowance, I worked part-time at a small accounting office downtown, studying and working late into the night. Every evening after balancing the books, I'd send part of my paycheck home. At first, it was just a few $100s a month, then slowly it became the electricity, the water, even the cost to repair the roof after a windstorm. My father would always say, "You know how tough times are, sweetheart. Your mother and I hate to bother you, but if you could help just a little." And my mother would sigh, "Sophie needs to focus on her art school. You're stronger, Emily. You can handle it." And every time I answered, "Of course, I'll take care of it." In ni wisdom mini pav. I paid my tuition by working 3 shifts a week, while Sophie, then attending a private art institute in California, had every expense covered by our parents. They even sent her a monthly allowance and funded her European inspiration trip. Whenever I called home, Mom would gush, "Did you see Sophie's photos? She's in Paris now. She looks so happy." I'd smile and say I was busy with classes. I never told her that the week before, I'd eaten instant noodles 4 days straight just to afford the semester fee. I thought, if Sophie was happy, maybe I was fulfilling my role. By the time I turned 20, I had officially taken on every fixed household expense: electricity, water, internet, even Mom's car insurance. Each time I sent money, she'd text back, "You're so thoughtful, Emily. Sophie never thinks like you do." It sounded tender, almost loving, but it was really another chain tightening around my neck, the invisible leash of responsibility. Whenever I felt tired, Mom would say, "If it weren't for you, we wouldn't know what to do." So I kept going. I took pride in being the one who made things work, the one who solved problems. It wasn't until much later that I realized I was also the only one paying the price for it. When I was 23, Sophie posted a picture on Instagram, her brand new car, a cream-colored Mini Cooper with a big red bow, straight out of a commercial. I remember staring at the screen for a long time, caught somewhere between laughter and bitterness. Beneath the photo, my mother commented, "You deserve everything, my sweet Sophie." Meanwhile, I was sitting in a small office, sipping cheap coffee, double-checking spreadsheets for clients. Just moments before, I had transferred $600 to my father to fix a broken water pipe. He texted back, "Thank you, Emily. You really are the pillar." That word pillar once made me proud. Now it sounded like a curse. I had thought about saying no. Once, when my mother texted asking for an extra $400 to replace the carpet because Sophie's allergic, I told her I didn't have enough to cover rent. She went silent for a few minutes, then replied with just 3 words, "It's okay then." Those words made me feel like the worst kind of person. That night, I sent the money along with a message, "I'm sorry, I was just tired." I didn't realize I was being controlled by guilt. Every time I even thought about keeping money for myself, a voice in my head whispered, "If you don't help, they'll be disappointed. And if they're disappointed, they'll abandon you." And to me, being abandoned was worse than being broke. After graduation, I was hired by a small investment analysis firm. I finally had a stable income, and almost immediately, my parents said it was time to give back. My mother told me, "Your father has worked hard his whole life. Help a little so we can finally rest." So I paid off their credit card debt, helped my father cover the mortgage, and bought my mother a new washing machine. And Sophie? She opened a small fashion boutique with money my parents had loaned her. I never asked how much. I only knew that I was once again thanked not for money this time, but for keeping everyone's spirit up. One evening, after wiring money to repair the leaking roof, I checked my savings account, $87 left. I was exhausted, but not angry. I just thought, maybe that's my role in this world. The rescuer, the fixer, the one who stands behind everyone else to keep them from falling. But when I thought back to my childhood, I began to see it clearly. I had been taught that love had to be earned through labor. And now, they were collecting the interest. I still remember the day my father said, "If it weren't for you, we'd lose this house." The words brought me to tears back then. I thought it was gratitude. I didn't understand that it was a chain. From that day on, whenever they said, "our home," all I heard was "the house you pay for." Still, I kept going. Because deep down, I was still terrified of losing them. Sometimes, when I was too tired to hold it all together, I'd turn to Sophie. She'd laugh softly and tell me I overthought everything. "You're always so tense. Mom and Dad aren't forcing you to do anything," she'd say, sipping wine from her crystal glass. I'd stay quiet. She didn't understand because she had never been forced to choose between love and self-respect. For Sophie, love was always given freely. For me, it was a prize you earned for being good enough. Those years, I lived like a number on a balance sheet, just adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, never once asking why. Until one day, when I saw Sophie flaunting her diamond engagement ring online, and my mother commented, "My daughter, my pride." I suddenly wondered, had she ever said that about me? And when the answer came back as no, I realized for the first time in years that my heart felt emptier than my bank account. Looking back now, I understand I wasn't bound by locks, but by obligation. They didn't need to shout or threaten, just whisper, "You're the only one who can help." And I, the girl who once shoveled snow until her fingers went numb just to be called strong, believed I was born to carry burdens. I didn't know that when you keep carrying everyone else, one day they forget you can get tired too, and when you finally stop, they call it betrayal. March of 2025 was unusually cold in Denver. Snow came late, the wind was dry and biting, and the city seemed half asleep under a pale gray sky. I had just finished a major project at work, my body drained but my mind light for the first time in months. That's when my mother called, her voice softer than usual. "If you're free, come home for dinner," she said sweetly. "I made your favorite roast." I hesitated, then agreed. Maybe, deep down, a small part of me still wanted to believe things could go back to the way they were. I arrived in Highlands Ranch just as night settled in. Warm yellow light spilled through the windows, and a thin layer of snow dusted the steps. From outside, I could hear laughter, gentle, intimate, and warm, the kind of laughter I hadn't heard in years. I stood at the door, ready to knock, when my father's voice broke through. "If we sell this house now, we could get around $700,000. The market's good." I froze, my heart slowed. Then came my mother's reply, softer, but crystal clear. "I told you, if we're going to sell, we have to do it before Emily finds out. She still thinks the money she sends is to help the family, not as an investment." She chuckled lightly. It's a gift, not ownership. Away's like line. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were talking about the house I had poured years of money, time, and effort into keeping. I had paid off parts of the mortgage, repaired the leaking roof, repainted the walls, and spent countless late nights budgeting to make sure they'd be okay. I thought they'd be grateful. But to them, I was just a wallet with a heartbeat. Then my father's voice came again. Her name's not on the deed, so she gets nothing. Everything she's done was voluntary. His words cut through me like a cold blade. I heard the faint clink of glasses on the table, then Sophie's hesitant voice. But Dad, she's contributed so much. If she finds out, she'll be hurt. My mother interrupted, confident, almost amused. Don't worry, Emily always thinks of others first. She won't question it. She's soft, predictable. Their laughter followed, gentle and careless, the sound of people toasting to betrayal. I stood there in the dark hallway, my hand gripping my bag until my knuckles turned white. The air around me grew thick, heavy. Every word they spoke peeled away another layer of the fragile trust I had spent a lifetime building. I used to think the worst thing a family could do is forget you, but I was wrong. The worst thing is when they remember you only as a source of money. Then Sophie's voice again, quieter this time. So, when you sell it, do I get a share? My father answered instantly, his tone cool and calculated. Of course. You'll need the money to expand your boutique, and your mother needs the rest to pay off her credit cards. Emily doesn't need anything, she lives alone, doesn't spend much. My mother added, lightly. And if she asks, we'll say it's to renovate Sophie's old place. She'll believe it. I felt something collapse inside me. Every year I had worked myself to exhaustion, every year so strong I'd ever been fed suddenly, they all sounded like jokes. I wanted to burst into the kitchen, to scream that I wasn't stupid, that I'd heard everything. But I didn't. I stayed silent. Because I had learned from them that anger makes you weak. Silence. Silence at the right moment is the only power they can't take from you. I stepped back, quietly, and walked out the door, letting the cold night wind slice through the heat rising in my chest. I drove back to Denver without turning on the lights in the car. The world outside was pitch black, but inside my head, everything was clear, terrifyingly clear. I remembered every bill I'd paid, every thank you they'd given me, every hollow hug after dinner. And I began to see it for what it was. Everything I had called family was nothing more than a well-rehearsed performance, one I had been funding all along. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't turn on the light. I sat down, took off my watch, and placed it on the table. The sound of metal against wood echoed softly, like the end of a sentence. For 30 years, I had let them define what kindness meant. I worked, I paid, I endured just to earn a kind of love that never existed. And now that the truth stood bare before me, I didn't feel like crying anymore. I felt only one thing, clarity. Because from this moment on, I would no longer be their Emily. I would be my own. And for the first time, my silence wasn't surrender, it was a vow. For the next 6 months, I lived 2 lives. By day, I was still Emily Harper, financial analyst at a consulting firm in downtown Denver, the woman who arrived early, stayed late, always wore a polite smile, and kept a cup of cold coffee beside her monitor. But when night fell, I became someone else entirely, a document detective, surrounded by files, bank receipts, and printed statements from the years I had tried so hard to erase. I no longer measured time in workweeks, but in how many financial records I had managed to recover. My small apartment in Reno became my makeshift office. Papers covered the desk, each folder meticulously arranged by year and marked in red ink. Mortgage, 2018. Utilities, 2019. Roof repairs, 2021. I missed nothing. Every night, I reopened old emails, reread every transfer confirmation, every message that said, "Thank you, you're such a good daughter." The irony wasn't lost on me. Those same thank yous, once tokens of affection, had now become the evidence that would make them pay. I opened a new spreadsheet, not for a client this time, but for myself. The first line, I titled, Highlands Ranch House, True Cost. I began entering numbers, one by one: $50,000 for the mortgage payments I had made on their behalf, $25,000 for roof repairs, new flooring, wall paint, and the replacement of the heating system, $15,000 for utilities, electricity, water, home insurance, maintenance, all transferred directly from my account. At the bottom, I added a separate line: unpaid labor, roof repairs, gardening, snow removal, fence painting. I searched local service websites and calculated the average rate: more than $40,000 if hired professionally. When the final number appeared, it shimmered on the screen in the dark: $90,000. That figure wasn't just a record of money, it was 30 years of endurance made visible. I no longer felt anger. My emotions had cooled into precision. In my work, I had always trusted data, and this time, data would become my justice. Every night, I printed a few more documents, clipped them neatly, annotated them in pencil: proof of financial contribution, evidence of intent to exclude ownership, transaction confirmations. I stored everything on a USB drive, then locked it in a small safe. When the metal door closed with a dull click, it sounded like a promise. One Friday night, I decided to study the law. I sat in front of my screen, reading through Colorado property statutes line by line, their dry legal language unfolding into something sharp and alive. That was when I discovered what my father had likely never considered. Under Colorado law, anyone who contributes significantly to a property's value, even without being listed on the deed, can claim equitable interest. I reread that passage 3 times, the words glowing on the screen like a key to a door they thought would stay locked forever. The following week, I met with my first attorney, Miss Peterson, a specialist in family property disputes. She listened carefully as I explained everything, flipping through the folders I'd brought, then looked up and said slowly, "If these numbers are accurate, you have a solid legal basis to claim at least 50% of the house's value." I asked, "Even if my name isn't on the title?" She nodded. "You contributed financially, you paid taxes, and you have proof. The law is on your side." It's not that. When I stepped out of her office, the Denver wind cut hard against my coat, but for the first time, I didn't feel cold. In the following week, I consulted 2 more attorneys, one in Boulder, another in downtown Denver. Both confirmed the same conclusion. One of them said plainly, "If you can prove intent to strip you of ownership, this case will be an easy win." Immediately, I thought of that night in Highlands Ranch, of my mother's voice saying, "She's gentle, predictable, not Mardet." I didn't need anything else. I had motive, evidence, and the law. Now, all I needed was timing. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my colleagues, not even a diary. I knew that a real war only begins when you're silent enough to hear your own heartbeat. I learned how to hide every trace. When sending emails, I used a new account. When printing documents, I did it at the office after everyone had gone home. I backed everything up on an encrypted drive, even sent a duplicate copy to a secure deposit box at the bank. I left no gaps, no loose ends. My family had always thought of me as predictable, but they forgot one thing: my job was to detect financial fraud, and this time, the audit target was them. One night, as I reviewed everything one last time, I reopened my spreadsheet. In the final column, I added a quiet note only I would understand: "I paid with trust, now it's their turn to pay with truth." I saved the file, locked it with a password, and stared at the dark screen reflecting my own face. The girl who once just wanted to be loved was gone. In her place sat a woman who had learned that love cannot survive in the shadow of exploitation. When everything was ready, I sent an email to Miss Peterson, my attorney, asking her to prepare for legal action if necessary. Her reply came within minutes, simple and steady: "I'm ready when you are." I read that line 3 times. Just a month ago, I had been the betrayed daughter. Now, I was the one holding every number that could change the entire equation. The last night before everything began, I brewed a cup of coffee and opened the window. The lights of Denver stretched out below like a field of falling stars. The city was still loud, still beautiful, still distant. I thought of my father, my mother, and Sophie. Perhaps they were sleeping soundly, certain that I was still the same old Emily, the one who would send money whenever they asked, the one who would smile through the hurt. They didn't know that in just a few days, the numbers and truths they dismissed would come knocking on their door. I closed the window, turned off the lights, and let the darkness fill the room. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I had learned to live inside it, even to make it my ally. Because only in the dark can you truly see what others try to hide. And I knew the next sunrise wouldn't just bring light, it would bring justice. September 2025. Autumn had arrived in Denver. The air was crisp and clear, the trees along the Reno streets turning gold. I still went to work as usual, still submitted my reports on time, still played the part of reliable Emily. But inside, I was waiting not for a miracle, but for the final piece of evidence, something that would complete the puzzle. I just didn't know it would come in the form of a message. That night, at exactly 10:47, I was pouring coffee when my phone buzzed. On the screen, Mom. I hesitated for a few seconds before opening it. The message was short, cold, and so cruel that I had to read it 3 times before I believed it. We've changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore. Let's see how brave you really are, haha. 19 words. But each one cut deep not because it hurt, but because it was crystal clear. I sat down, the phone still in my hand. My chest didn't tighten like it used to. There were no tears, no fear. Only absolute silence, like I had reached the end of the road as the betrayed one and stepped into the beginning of something else entirely, the beginning of resistance. I stared at the message for a long time, the blue light from the screen reflecting against my face. Haha, I read that word again, and something strange moved in my chest. They hadn't just locked the door, they were mocking me. And somehow, instead of pain, I felt light. So light that I laughed not because it was funny, but because it was freedom. Everything I needed was contained in that one message, the perfect proof, the final line in a 3-decade-long script of manipulation. I took a screenshot, saved it, and sent a copy to my secure email, labeling it in red, primary evidence, intent to exclude. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor, surrounded by a stack of files thicker than a dictionary. Every page, every number, every photograph had led me to this moment. I could see my journey as clearly as a financial chart, starting at the peak of hope, plunging into the valley of betrayal, and slowly, steadily climbing back up through patience and clarity. And now, the line had reached its breakout point. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Rockies, I called Miss Peterson. She answered after 2 rings, her voice calm and steady. "Emily," she said. "I'm guessing it's time?" I forwarded her the screenshot, and within a minute she replied, "This proves intent to exclude ownership. We have everything we need. I'll draft the lawsuit today." I nodded, gripping my phone, feeling warmth rush through my veins for the first time in years. I arrived at the office early that morning but couldn't focus. I opened my laptop and started a new email address to myself. Subject: Day 1 of freedom. In the body, I typed only one line: "They changed the locks." I opened another door. Then I saved it, like a promise. When I stepped out of the building that afternoon, the wind was sharp, swirling golden leaves around my feet. I looked up at Denver's pale blue sky, sunlight streaming through the trees, and realized I was no longer the girl who proved her worth by paying bills or enduring pain. I had changed roles. I wasn't asking to be seen anymore. I was reclaiming what was mine. That night, I sat at my desk, papers and legal documents scattered across the surface. Miss Peterson had sent me the draft of the lawsuit. Emily Harper v. Robert and Linda Harper equitable property claim. I read every line, every clause, every number. 50% of the house's value, $350,000. I thought of the nights I'd stayed up making spreadsheets, of the countless transfers sent in silence, of every empty thank you they'd ever given me. Now, all of it finally had meaning. Each piece of evidence had become a brick in the wall of justice I was building for myself. When I signed my name at the bottom of the document, a sharp ache rippled through my chest, not from fear, but from the realization that I was cutting the last thread that tied me to them. I was no longer the pillar, no longer the strong daughter, no longer the obedient one. I was simply Emily Harper, a woman who no longer belonged to that white-fenced house. Night fell, and I opened the window, looking south toward Highlands Ranch, lying quiet beneath the distant city lights. I pictured them in the living room, talking, certain they'd already won. Maybe my mother was laughing, Sophie showing off her new collection, my father still calculating the house's market value. They had no idea that while they laughed, the law had already begun to move. And for the first time, I didn't feel small before them. I saw them shrinking instead, folding in on themselves, trapped by their own arrogance. I brewed a cup of tea and set my phone on the table. My mother's message was still there, the last line unerased. I read it again, this time without trembling. "You don't have a home anymore." I smiled. "You're right," I whispered. Because my home was never there. From that moment on, I knew I would never go back to Highlands Ranch. I no longer needed to prove loyalty to a place built on exploitation. I didn't need to beg for affection from a house that had locked its doors against me. I had already found my own key through intellect, through law, and through the very strength they had always underestimated. When I turned off the lights, the darkness filled the room, but it didn't scare me anymore. It felt like a thin blanket draped gently over me, warm, protective, familiar. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I slept peacefully, not out of exhaustion, but out of freedom. The next morning, as the lawsuit was officially filed, I was in an internal meeting at work when my phone began to vibrate nonstop. 3 missed calls, then 4, then 5. I glanced down discreetly. The same number each time, private number. I knew it wasn't a client. I let it ring. 2 hours later, an email arrived. The subject line was simple, from Harper Family Attorney, urgent. The body contained only one line, "We have a problem. Call immediately. Thank you for watching, Saz, I ham died." Below it was the signature of Charles Denton, my parents' longtime attorney, the same man who had handled their taxes and mortgage paperwork for over 20 years. I didn't reply. I just stared at the email for a long time, then marked it unread. I wanted them to feel what I had felt for years, the sting of being ignored. The quiet ache of sending something out into the void and never hearing a response. That afternoon the phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I listened only to hear how she would begin. Her voice trembled, different from the calm I was used to. "Emily, what is this? Are you really suing your parents?" I stayed silent, hearing her quick breaths over the line. Behind her, my father cut in, sharp, "Give me the phone, Linda." Then, his voice hardened, like steel. "What are you doing? Do you intend to destroy this family?" I answered evenly, "No, I'm only protecting my share. The part you plan to sell behind my back. You." There was a pause on the other end, then he barked, "You have no share, Emily. That house isn't in your name." I spoke slowly, one word at a time. "Have you forgotten? In finance, there's something called equitable interest. I have proof, and the court will see it." A long silence stretched out. Then my mother murmured, almost whispering, "Emily, you can't do this to your family. We can talk without going to court." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "I've been talking to you for 10 years, I said. "You only listen when there's a lawyer involved, right?" She drew a breath, trying to steady her voice. "You're misunderstanding. We are still a family." I cut her off. "No, Mom. Families don't send a haha after changing the locks." After that call my phone was quiet for a few hours, then exploded with messages. First from my father, "Someone's pushing you, aren't they? Outsiders don't care about you like family does." Then from my mother, "I don't know why you would do this. I just worry people will laugh at us." Finally, Sophie, I know this is tense. But what good does suing Mom and Dad do? You're only hurting them more. Are you mad about that handbag the other day? If so, I'm sorry, okay?" I read each message and then locked my screen. None of them mentioned the truth. No one asked why I had to go this far. They only worried about losing face, losing money, losing status. I realized then that my silence scared them more than any protest ever could. 2 days later, Miss Peterson forwarded me a copy of an email from the other side. Dear Miss Harper, our clients wish to resolve this matter privately to avoid litigation. If possible, please contact us before we file a formal response. I didn't reply right away. I wanted them to wait to feel what it was like to be powerless before the person they'd once treated as a pawn. That evening, I finally messaged Miss Peterson, proceed as planned, no negotiation. Her response came almost instantly, understood. Later that night, I turned my phone back on and saw more than 30 unread messages from Sophie. Please, Emily, just hear me out. They're panicking. Mom's been crying nonstop. If you want, I'll talk to them and make them apologize. Just don't take this to court, okay? I'm sorry if I ever made you upset. It's so presented in now. But the next message revealed the truth. If you win, I'll lose my share of the house too. Do you understand that? That was it. There was no remorse, only fear of losing what she thought was hers. I set the phone down, poured myself another cup of tea, and felt a calm settle over me like still water on an autumn lake. I used to think I needed them to feel complete, but now I understood it was they who couldn't stand losing me. That night, I stepped out onto the balcony and watched the Denver skyline flicker in the distance. The cold wind carried the scent of damp wood and exhaust. I thought of the little girl who painted the fence alone, of the 20-year-old who sent home every dollar she earned, of the woman who sat in her car that snowy night watching her mother hand a gift bag to Sophie. And I realized all those versions of me had died, so that the woman standing here could exist steady, unshaken, and calm before the storm. 3 days later, their lawyers sent a formal response, requesting that both parties pause for negotiation. I signed the reply that Miss Peterson had drafted. My client declines. The hearing will proceed as scheduled. Less than an hour later, Sophie called on video. Her face appeared on the screen, eyes red, lips trembling, but with that same trace of pride she'd always worn. Do you really want to do this? She asked softly. I answered evenly, I don't want to. I need to. Maybe for the first time in my life, I need to do this for myself. She lowered her head, her voice breaking. Mom will never forgive you for this. I smiled faintly. Mom never forgave me, even when I hadn't done anything wrong. Thank you for watching. After that call, I turned off my phone not to hide, but to be still before the real storm began. Inside, I felt no fear. They could use money, reputation, or tears, but this time, they couldn't use family as a weapon. I had learned that sometimes the bravest thing isn't forgiveness, it's letting people face the consequences of what they've done. As night fell, I watched the city lights shimmer against the window pane, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I understood then, this battle was no longer about reclaiming money, it was about reclaiming myself. And for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty, I would not lose. The mediation hearing was set for early October at the Denver County Courthouse. The sky that morning was startlingly clear, the air cool and crisp, the trees along Colfax Avenue swaying gently in the breeze. I arrived early, carrying the leather case that held the 200 pages I had prepared over weeks. Inside were every transfer, every receipt, every trace of exploitation now bound together as evidence. I felt no tremor, no fear. Each step I took was firm and deliberate, as if the autumn wind had washed away the last traces of weakness from my soul. The mediation room was on the 11th floor of a glass building in downtown Denver. Sunlight streamed through the wide window, spilling across the long table where 4 chairs had been set in place. I sat at one end beside my attorney, Miss Peterson. She handed me a cup of hot tea and whispered, "They'll try to play on your emotions. Don't let them steer you anymore." I nodded, inhaling deeply. The door opened, they entered. My father walked in first, still wearing the same old suit, his eyes sharp with anger. My mother followed, a tissue in hand, her face carefully made up but her lips trembling. Sophie came last, silent, clutching her phone tightly. The air in the room grew heavy. I rose to my feet and gave a small nod in greeting. None of them responded. Their attorney, Mr. Denton, took his seat, placing a much thinner folder on the table before speaking. First, he began smoothly. We'd like to emphasize that this is a family misunderstanding. My clients believe the money Emily transferred over the years was voluntary support, not a legally binding contribution. He paused and looked at me, as if waiting for a reaction. But I only smiled faintly and gestured to Miss Peterson. Her voice was steady and crisp. Sir, my client has contributed more than $90,000 toward the mortgage, in addition to over $40,000 in direct labor value, including roof repairs, landscaping, and ongoing property maintenance at the Highlands Ranch residence. All are supported by invoices, bank statements, and documented correspondence. Furthermore, we have messages showing a deliberate intent to exclude her from the property accompanied by mockery. That message constitutes evidence of malice and further strengthens her equitable interest claim. She slid the folder across the table. I saw my father glance at it, his face reddening. He slammed his palm down hard, his voice sharp as iron. Enough, you have no right, Emily. Everything you did was your duty as a daughter. You're dragging this family's name through the mud. I didn't answer. I just looked directly at him, calm, so calm that even I was surprised by it. Then I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. No one ever asked you to pay for what you did, Father. But I did pay for everything. And now, it's time I get back what's fair. My mother burst into tears, pulling out her tissue, her voice trembling. Don't you see? This is killing me. How could you bring your parents to court? I looked at her and remembered every cold message, every time she'd said I was strong enough not to need love. My voice came out soft as a breath. Mom, I'm not bringing my parents to court. I'm bringing the truth to where it belongs. Sophie, who had been silent all along, finally looked up. Her eyes darted from me to our mother, confusion flickering behind the guilt. For a brief moment, I saw something real in her gaze, recognition, maybe even regret. When Miss Peterson slid a printed copy of the message across the table, the one that read, "We've changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore. Let's see how brave you really are, haha." The room went utterly still. I heard my father's sharp inhale, saw my mother bow her head, her lips trembling uncontrollably. Mr. Denton frowned, turning to her. "Mrs. Harper, is this message authentic?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched, heavy and raw, but she didn't need to. The truth was already sitting in the space between us, undeniable. And I could tell from the look in Denton's eyes he understood everything. "Miss Peterson," continued, her voice clear and precise, each word striking like a gavel. "Under Colorado property law, when one party contributes significantly in both finances and labor, even without being listed on the deed, they retain an equitable interest in the asset. Furthermore, this message demonstrates a deliberate intent to exclude and unlawfully claim ownership. My client has full legal grounds to demand no less than 50% of the property's value, equivalent to $350,000. My father couldn't contain himself any longer. He slammed his hand on the table. "She's talking nonsense. Emily, you'll regret this. You owe us your life." I looked at him steadily. "No, Father. I owe you a childhood, not a life. And today, I'm paying it back in full." The air in the room thickened, heavy with tension. The only sounds were the rustle of paper and the scratch of pens signing documents. Across from me, Sophie stared down at the stack of files, her eyes glistening. Maybe, for the first time, she saw what I had seen all along, that the happy family they clung to was nothing more than a thin shell covering years of quiet injustice. When the mediation session ended, the court representative suggested that both parties consider a settlement. Mr. Denton leaned toward my parents and spoke quietly. "With this level of evidence, I strongly advise you to accept the 50-50 split. Going to trial will only make things worse." My father snapped, "No, I won't let that ungrateful child take my money." My mother lowered her head but didn't protest. I looked at them, and for the first time in many years, I didn't see myself as their victim. I saw them as small, lost, and trapped in the cage of their own pride. I stood, gathered my documents, and said evenly, I never wanted to win. I only wanted fairness. But if justice is the only thing that can make you understand that, then I'm ready. No one spoke after that. As I walked out, the door closed softly behind me, and with it, it felt like the door to my past finally closed too. Outside, the sky was an impossible blue. Sunlight reflected off the wet pavement from the previous night's rain, scattering bright shards of light across the street. I stood there for a moment on the courthouse steps, the wind brushing through my hair, and felt something I hadn't in years: lightness. Not because I had won, but because I had stood my ground, spoken my truth, and no longer trembled. In finance, I'd learned there are two kinds of people: those who fear loss, and those who dare to start over. Today, I had become the second. Behind me, the mediation room door remained closed. I didn't need to turn back, because in that moment, I knew I had just reclaimed the one thing they never thought I was strong enough to keep: the right to own my own life. The verdict was delivered on a Monday morning, just 2 weeks after the mediation. I was present in the small courtroom of the Denver County Court, where the early light streamed through tall windows and cast golden lines across the beige walls. The judge, a silver-haired woman with calm, steady eyes, read the decision in a voice that was quiet but carried more weight than any words I had ever heard in my life. After reviewing all evidence, the court recognizes Miss Emily Harper as holding an equitable 50% ownership of the property located at 2140 Highland Ranch Drive, valued at $700,000. The property is to be mandatorily sold, and proceeds shall be divided according to the designated share, after taxes and expenses. Each sentence landed like the final hammer striking the end of 30 years of injustice. I didn't cheer, I didn't smile. I just sat still, watching my hands tremble slightly. Miss Peterson leaned over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You won," she whispered. I nodded gently, though there was no triumph in me, only silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm too long endured. Across the room, my father sat with his head bowed, fingers interlocked, his face pale with fury. My mother didn't cry, she just stared ahead at nothing, her eyes hollow, as if she'd lost a part of herself. Sophie sat between them, exhausted, lips pressed tightly together. As the judge left the room, I heard my father mutter under his breath, "I can't believe it, she actually did it." My mother replied softly, almost to herself, "She's not our Emily anymore." They were right, I wasn't their Emily anymore. I was mine. The sale of the house happened quickly. The lawyers and the bank representatives handled everything because I refused to set foot there again. The house in Highlands Ranch, once their symbol of a perfect family, was sealed and listed for sale, a for sale sign planted right in front of the white fence I had painted years ago. When I saw the photo attached in the realtor's email, I didn't feel nostalgia, just emptiness. Not sadness, not relief, just release. A month later, the house sold for exactly $700,000. After taxes and fees, my share came to $350,000. The money was deposited directly into a new account I had opened at Frontier Bank, the same bank where, years ago, I had paid off my father's first mortgage installment. Life, it seemed, had closed itself in a perfect circle. My parents received their half, another $350,000, but, according to what Miss Peterson later told me, most of it went toward credit card debt and legal expenses. Their long-planned retirement in Arizona evaporated within weeks. One evening, I received an email from Sophie. It was short. "Emily, I don't know what to say. I know they were wrong, but everything's falling apart. Mom won't eat, Dad won't talk to anyone. I just wanted to ask, could things have gone differently?" I read her words, feeling neither anger nor sympathy, just a quiet ache. Then I typed my reply. They could have, if someone had told the truth from the start. I hit send, knowing there would be no reply. 3 months later, I officially signed the papers for my new apartment in Lodo, downtown Denver, the place I had always dreamed of living. It was small but full of light, with glass walls overlooking the Platte River, just a short walk from the cafes I used to watch from the office window during long nights at work. I chose everything myself, from the oak table to the sheer white curtains to the small cactus I placed by the window. When the delivery man dropped off the furniture, he joked, "Living alone?" I smiled. "No, living with freedom." He didn't understand, but I didn't need him to. In the first few weeks, I still woke up early, still brewed my morning coffee, still sat in front of my laptop out of habit, but the feeling was different. I no longer had to prove anything to anyone. I transferred my first $50,000 into a private savings account and invested the rest into a small fund I named Harper Balance, an ironic but fitting name. I didn't create the fund out of revenge. I created it to rebuild my life using the same strength they once dismissed. Word of the lawsuit spread through the family, of course. An aunt called me, her voice a mix of reproach and reluctant admiration. "You really went all in, Emily. But, maybe it was time they learned a lesson." I simply replied, "I'm not teaching anyone anything. I just stopped staying silent." 2. Sometimes, when driving through Highlands Ranch on business trips, I'd see rows of identical houses, white fences, green lawns, perfect curtains, and I'd realize that peaceful appearances often hide the deepest cracks. I no longer wanted to live within those walls. I haven't seen my parents since the trial. Once, Miss Peterson informed me they had sent a letter proposing an out-of-court resolution, hoping to preserve their reputation. I declined. Not out of bitterness, but because I knew that to end a cycle, you must stop responding to apologies that arrive too late. Sophie was different. She still texted me occasionally, long messages tangled in regret and fear. "Do you think Mom ever loved us, in her own way?" she asked once. I didn't reply. Some questions don't need answers, they just need time. One quiet weekend evening, I stood by the Lodo apartment window, watching sunlight fall across the river. Everything was still except for the faint sound of piano music drifting from the floor below. I opened my laptop, checked my account, and saw the same $350,000 sitting there, barely touched. Not because I was frugal, but because every time I looked at that number, I remembered, justice isn't something handed down by a court. It's the moment you no longer live in fear of being taken from again. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat down, feeling the warmth spread through my palms. Outside, the Denver sky gleamed bright blue, reflecting off the glass of the building across from mine. I thought about everything: the white fence, the haha message, the years I had spent straining to be loved. And I realized that true victory didn't lie in a court ruling or a sum of money. It was here, in this quiet moment, in the simple fact that I could sit alone without fear, without needing anyone's approval, just peace. I closed my laptop, stood up, and opened the balcony door. A soft wind drifted in, carrying the scent of coffee and the distant hum of city traffic. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and for the first time, I felt it clearly: the past had closed, and the present was opening. And justice, the kind I had longed for, was never about making someone lose. It was about finally being able to live, to breathe, to be free. In the weeks following the verdict, my life entered a strange, quiet rhythm. No more legal emails. No more tense calls. No more messages asking me to think of the family. Communication from Robert, Linda, and Sophie stopped entirely after I blocked every number and email they used. I didn't do it out of hatred, I did it for peace. Forgiveness cannot exist where there is no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And I was too tired to keep waiting for an apology that would never come. Mornings in my Lodo apartment became small rituals of beginning again. I woke up early, unrolled my yoga mat by the window, and breathed in the crisp air instead of opening my laptop right away. Every Friday, I attended a support group in downtown Denver, a circle of people who, like me, had been manipulated by their families. We sat together, sharing stories without interruption. At first, I only listened. Some cried as they spoke of being erased from a parent's will. Others trembled, recounting threatening texts from siblings. Strangely, among these strangers, I felt at home. No one judged. No one asked, "Why couldn't you just endure a little longer?" We simply nodded, quietly telling each other, "I understand. I've been there too. I started keeping a journal each night, something I had never done when I still lived under their roof. I wrote about my childhood, about that snowy night when I was 12, about the first time I heard my mother laugh as I was being blamed for something I hadn't done. Every page felt like unwinding a knot that had been tied inside me for years. Some nights I wrote until 2 in the morning, tears dripping onto the paper, blurring the ink. But the next morning, when I reread it, I didn't see weakness. I saw release. Every weekend, I drove west to the Rocky Mountains. I hiked alone along the trails around Bear Lake, where the air smelled of pine and the streams whispered over smooth stones. Out there, I wasn't a victim or a victor. I was just Emily, a woman relearning how to take each step without carrying the weight of her memories. I remember standing on a ridge one morning, looking down at the valley below. The cold wind bit at my face, and my chest felt hollow but in a good way. There was a stillness in me I'd never known before. Not happiness, not excitement, something deeper, quieter, peace. I began making new friends, people who knew nothing about the lawsuit or the years that came before it. A woman from my yoga class invited me to a meditative painting workshop. A coworker asked if I wanted to catch a live jazz show downtown. For the first time in years, I laughed without effort. I wasn't afraid of being misunderstood or judged. I didn't need to prove that I was good enough to belong. I just was, and that, finally, was enough. Sometimes, I still thought of them. Not with anger but with clarity. Robert, who believed power came from control, Linda, who used affection as a leash, and Sophie, who never understood that being the favored one was its own kind of prison. Maybe they were still living in another house somewhere, playing out the same old script, convincing themselves that I was the ungrateful one. But none of that had anything to do with me anymore. I had stepped off their stage. I was no longer the technician in the dark, keeping their spotlight steady. One December afternoon, I sat in the little cafe beneath my building, golden light spilling across the wooden tables. I opened my laptop and pulled up an old file, Harper Case. My cursor hovered over the delete icon. I hesitated for just a moment, then pressed it. Gone. Completely. Without a trace of regret, I didn't need to hold on to evidence from a war I'd already won. What mattered was walking into the future unburdened. That night, back home, I brewed a cup of coffee and opened the window to the reflection of Denver's lights shimmering on the Platte River. I played my favorite song, Clair de Lune. The piano notes fell softly, like snow. I smiled, feeling, for the first time, that I owed nothing to anyone. I didn't owe my family an explanation, didn't owe the past a single question, and didn't owe myself an apology. I had done everything I could, and finally, I chose to let go. Before going to bed, I opened my journal and wrote the last entry of that year. They once locked the door, thinking I'd always be left outside. But what they never knew is that I learned how to build another home, one made of self-respect, truth, and my own hands. Then I closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and let the night wrap around the room in quiet peace. A few months later, I was invited to speak as a guest at a small community seminar titled Healing from Family Manipulation. When I stepped onto the stage and looked out at the audience, I saw in every face a version of myself, someone who had been dismissed, overlooked, and was now just trying to find peace. I told my story not for sympathy, but to remind them that justice isn't something a court delivers. It's the moment you find the courage to say, enough. At the end of the talk, someone asked, "Do you think you'll ever forgive them?" I smiled and said, "Forgiveness isn't going back. It's walking forward without carrying them with you." The room fell silent for a moment, then filled with long, steady applause. That night, I came home and opened the window, letting the cool air pour in. My Lodo apartment finally felt like a home, not because of its address or its value, but because it was a place where I could breathe, laugh, and simply exist as myself. I sat down, sipped my coffee, and looked at the faint glow of my laptop screen. Under the title box of the new video I was editing, I typed the description. If you've ever been hurt by your own family, don't be ashamed. Share your story. Somewhere out there, someone might need to hear it, just like I once did. I clicked save, leaned back in my chair, and smiled. Not the smile of victory, but of freedom. In that moment, I knew. I didn't need the white fence, or their approval, or their recognition. I had finally found the most valuable thing of all, myself.